Support comes from Empower Missouri's Affordable Housing Coalition, working to address the causes of housing insecurity and homelessness through tenant advocacy. Information at empowermissouri.org/housing.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking. Hi, everybody. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a politics correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio. State Representative Alex Riley has the great power and great responsibility of deciding which bills get debated in his chamber. But the current House Majority Leader will soon become one of the most powerful political figures in Missouri state government when he is likely to become Speaker of the House in 2027. Before he gets to that point, Riley will need to get through a 2026 legislative session that could be defined by a tough budgetary situation and potential roadblocks in the Missouri Senate. And it's also unclear just how large the GOP majority will be, given national polling showing a sharp downturn in fortunes for Republicans. Last week, Riley was a guest on the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. And what you'll hear now is an extended version of that conversation. I first asked Riley to tell us a little bit about himself and what got him interested in Missouri politics.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I am an attorney here in Springfield. I do a lot of work with businesses, business owners, people who want to start businesses, and really help them navigate every step of the legal process. More importantly than that, though, my favorite hat that I wear is I'm a dad. I've got 4 little kids. I've got a 6-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl, a 3-year-old boy, and then a new-ish 4-month-old little girl.
Well, I was gonna make some sort of joke about how having 4 kids is probably like wrangling legislative votes, but does that fact that you have lots and lots of kids make you well suited to be Speaker of the House?
You know, it's kind of funny because there is some overlap in the skill set. The way some legislators can react sometimes can look a little bit like toddlers. So I do think there is some overlap there.
Did you know early in your tenure in the Missouri House that you wanted to become Speaker? If so, why? If not, has this been kind of a surprising trajectory for you?
You know, I think it's something I've been interested in since day one. You know, for me and my family, I wanted to do something that would have the biggest impact possible. And for House members that's moving into House leadership, as our listeners here know, like that's where you have the most ability to impact change and do positive things for the state. So it's definitely something I was interested in. I didn't necessarily know for sure that was going to all work out that way, but I was interested in it.
I don't think you had any competition when you were like seeking out the speakership. You kind of were elevated by acclamation. Is that correct, or was this like a bruising process to get here?
So you are correct. At one point in time, there was another person who was looking at it. He ended up deciding to do something different. So for me, a lot of it, I think, was because I spent a lot of time building relationships with every faction within the House Republican caucus. And as you know, we have a lot. It's not really true that we just have a Republican supermajority where everyone thinks the same and votes the same way. We really have more like 4 or 5 or 6 different factions that see the world very differently. And for me, what I wanted to do was focus on bringing those factions together as much as I can around the shared policy goals that we have. Because even as different as the factions in the House are, and as different as the different parts of the state are geographically, we all have things in common. And I wanted to focus on those things that we have in common, working towards getting those policies done. And that was something that the caucus appreciated. And I think the results sort of speak for themselves at this point.
What do you think are going to be some of the key differences in how you lead as speaker compared to the current speaker, John Patterson, or past speakers like Speaker Dean Plocher or Speaker Rob Vescovo?
I think all of us are very different. I get along really well with Speaker Patterson, which I appreciate. That's, I think, one of the reasons that we had such a productive legislative session last year is in the past, we've seen a lot of tension between speakers and majority leaders, and then House leadership and Senate leadership, and then the legislature versus the governor. Right now, we have this really great dynamic where all of us in House leadership, Senate leadership, and the governor's office try and work together as much as we can on shared policy goals. So that's been something that's been helpful. But I am definitely different from those other folks. And, one of the things that I like to focus on is trying to empower each individual member of the House of Representatives to represent their constituents to the best of their ability. And that looks different. It's all about trying to find what each person is good at, what they're interested in, and empower them to represent their constituents and get their policy agenda to the governor's desk, at least as much of it as we can.
So let's talk about the current legislative session. We talked about Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe's income tax plan in the prior segment. That proposal is being shepherded by House Speaker John Patterson. My understanding is there was a new version of this ballot proposal that was recently put forward that's different from the one that a lot of people saw after the State of the State. Do you think that the end result will ultimately mirror what Kehoe talked about in his speech, which means a 5-year phase out, triggers that will stop the phase out if revenue declines, and perhaps some carve outs to expanding the sales tax, meaning that it wouldn't be applied to things like agriculture, healthcare, or real estate?
I do. In broad strokes, I do think that's where we end up. As far as the exact legislation that's been filed, I do think it's going to look different by the time it makes it all the way through the process. The legislative process is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to have lots of diverse viewpoints that are represented and have those views taken into account as much as they can. So I think there's going to be changes to those bills as they go through committee and as they go onto the floor of the House and ultimately work their way through the Senate too. So I think broadly speaking, it's going to end up something like what the governor has talked about in his State of the State address. But I do think the exact language will look different than what's been filed so far.
I think that a lot of people, if they're presented with the option to not pay an income tax anymore, their gut reaction would be like, yeah, that sounds great. There are 9 other states that don't have an income tax. I would rather keep that money than give it to state government. But I think the big unanswered question is kind of two different questions, basically. So I guess the two big unanswered questions is, does getting rid of the sales tax drop state revenue so much you can't do basic services? And if the answer is no, does the replacement tax, which in this case would be an expanded sales tax, does it have a lot of negative consequences, like making things that people buy prohibitively expensive? So I guess that's a two-part question, but how do you make sure you do this without state government basically imploding from lack of revenue? And how do you do this without making life harder for consumers by making sales tax significantly higher?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question that should be front of mind for every single legislator. And I think what the governor has proposed strikes that right balance. So the way he has it proposed with a phase out period, I think helps us make sure that we're not going to go over some sort of fiscal cliff. That is something that all of us in the Republican majority are very cognizant of. We're concerned about. We want to make sure that as we are shifting this tax structure to account for a 21st century economy and structured in a way that fosters economic growth rather than hampers it, that's something that's front of our minds. And I think with a phase out where you have it multiple steps over a multiple year period helps accomplish that. We've watched Kansas, we've watched some other states try it and not do it very well. And what we've tried to do is adjust for that and make sure that we don't go down the same road. What we want to do with this is create something that on paper is pretty darn close to revenue neutral. But ultimately, because of shifting the way taxation is done, it's creating something that will be much more beneficial for the economy. As we're looking around the country and seeing what states are growing from every perspective, whether it's population going to the states, whether it's economic growth outperforming other peer states, what you see is those states that have zero income tax overperform compared to every other state. And that's true across the board, whether it's, the red states like Texas or Florida or Tennessee, or even blue states like Washington that are kind of bucking the trend that you see in other high tax states. They have no income tax and their economy's been growing. They aren't hemorrhaging population like California, Illinois, New York, places like that. And I think a lot of it is because of the way they have their tax system structured. The income tax is so damaging to economic growth that when you tax in a different way, you'll have economic benefits to the state.
I think the counterpoint to bringing up those states, though, is that people would say Missouri does not have nearly the tourism attractions that states like Nevada, Florida, and even Tennessee have. They also don't have oil and natural gas like Alaska and Texas have. We actually asked the governor about what sort of thing Missouri has that would generate a lot of revenue if the income tax went away. He said tourism. And look, I like going to Branson as much as everybody else. I like Lake of the Ozarks too. Would you concede, though, that those type of destinations are not nearly as big of draws as places like Florida or Nevada or even Tennessee? Missouri just may not have that thing that could attract a lot of revenue like those other states.
I would agree to a point that we don't have the same tourism draws as Florida and California. California is not a no income tax state, but we certainly don't have the same tourism draws as other parts of the country. At the same time, one of the things that we do have that's different, that makes us strong, and that I think makes this work, is we have a very diverse economy. We aren't as dependent on one particular thing. We have a manufacturing base. We have a strong services sector. We have a strong agriculture sector. We have a lot of things that help make our economy diverse and strong. And I think that will help too.
Switching to something that was heard this week, lawmakers in the House heard bills this week on making a ban on hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and gender-affirming surgery for minors permanent. Is this something that is actually going to pass this year, or is there going to be pressure to hold off to pass this session? So backers of a measure repealing most of the 2024 abortion rights amendment can say a yes vote bans gender-affirming care for minors permanently.
So it is a serious effort this year, and I can speak for the House for sure that is something that we want to do, that we want to provide those protections in place for kids here in the state. We're coming up against the sunset where it will expire here in the next year or two. And for us in the House that have made protecting kids a priority, that is something that we want to work on and get done this year.
I guess the counterpoint that you probably heard from a lot of witnesses is that especially hormone therapy and puberty blockers helps a lot of kids become more comfortable with the gender identity that they feel with inside of them, and that banning this could lead them to even more mental health care problems in the future. What would you say to some of those folks?
Yeah, my perspective on that is once you're an adult, that's completely fine. But for kids in particular, where they're still developing, they're having a lot of struggles, uh, putting those types of things into bodies at that age can be very damaging. And we've seen places in Europe start to roll back some of these types of things. We see it around the country here in the United States too. And from my perspective, once you're an adult, like totally fine, do whatever you want. But for kids in particular, we want to make sure that they are protected.
So I would guess from that answer that if you're speaker in 2027 and one of your colleagues tries to, let's just say, ban hormone therapy and gender affirming surgery for adults, which let's not forget in 2023 was basically going to be the case under Andrew Bailey's emergency rules that were eventually struck down, those bills would basically go to legislative purgatory and never see the light of day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not something I support for adults. When you're an adult, my perspective is you can do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting other people. So if you make that decision for yourself, I think you should be able to do that. It's kids that I'm concerned about.
One of the reasons why expectations for the 2026 session are frankly kind of low is that Senate Democrats may try to slow the process down even on non-controversial measures. We saw that this week when they were filibustering gubernatorial nominees. Will that make it more difficult to pass things like the income tax plan we've talked about, or even things that are not overtly controversial but maybe used as leverage? Because Democrats in the Senate are still very upset that debate was cut off so much, both in the regular and special sessions last year.
Yeah, I do think that is likely. One thing I would note from my perspective, policy debates are absolutely fair game. Republicans and Democrats, and as we've talked about, different factions within the Republican parties and the Democrat Party see the world very differently when it comes to policy and what they think is the best thing for the state and for their constituents. What I hope we don't see, and I think will be nothing but damaging for the state, is if you see people holding up non controversial, overwhelmingly bipartisan things for their own political advantage. That's what concerns me the most. And I hope once we get through these first few weeks of session, or maybe even the first couple months of session, as we're trying to work through the bumps and navigate some of those past hurt feelings, which I understand and respect, I would just want to make sure that there is a group that is willing to govern and do the things that we need to do to make our state grow and thrive. And when we have bipartisan things, especially things that we just all agree, hey, we need to do this. I'll say, we're working on bills right now in the House on sex trafficking, which is a big problem across the state of Missouri, certainly along the I-44 corridor, which attaches, my hometown of Springfield to yours there in St. Louis, that we can set aside some of the partisan bickering to work together on those types of things to help the people in our state.
I guess as, again, a counterpoint to what you said, and I don't think that people are going to I agree with you that it would be unseemly to filibuster things that stop sex trafficking, for instance, unless it's bad policy. If it's bad policy, I totally understand that. Senate Democrats were very direct right before they were cut off last year, telling Republicans, if you do this, there are going to be consequences, and the session is going to go less good if you end up going through with what's known as the previous question. Now, I understand you're in the House and you don't control what the Senate does, but if that ends up happening, isn't that just a consequence of the Republicans following through on stifling Democratic debate?
Like I said, I think that when we're having real debate on policy differences, that's absolutely fair game. And I think that in those types of circumstances, the filibuster is absolutely appropriate. And then it's up to the various parties involved to try and navigate that, negotiate something. And if they can't, then I do think that when you have a overwhelming majority, that there should be a mechanism for that overwhelming majority to win. Um, but at the same time, I don't have patience or agree with the notion that we're going to shut down the session and prevent good things from happening that will protect our state and help our people here just because of disagreements over certain policies and procedural moves that happened in the past. I think when we have those types of things that everyone overwhelmingly agrees are good and that we need to do, that we should get those things done.
So there is a political role to being the speaker designee. You basically are responsible for making sure the House Republicans have a good election night this November. And I'm going to criticize, I guess, like journalist prognosticators in Missouri, including myself. There's been predictions for years that the GOP would lose their supermajority in the House, only for Democratic gains to be minimal or non-existent. But if it is a very bad election year for Republicans nationally, and at this point in time, which is, I guess, January 23rd, 2026, the polls are not looking great for Republicans nationally. Is it possible this is a year where your caucus does not come out election night unscathed and you might lose a few seats just because the national environment swings back toward the Democrats?
I think every single year, to your point, we hear prognostications that the Republicans are going to lose seats and sometimes large numbers of seats in the House of Representatives and even in the Senate, too. Including even last year when, I mean, as late as September and October, folks, including some in the minority party leadership, were talking that they thought that we were going to, we as Republicans were going to lose 5+ seats. And then we ended up coming into the session with the exact same number of representatives as we did in the prior General Assembly. So I think at this point, it's really too early to say which way the cycle is going to go. I will say from my perspective, we have a very strong bench of incoming candidates. We have really strong candidates in a lot of the swing districts, whether it's the St. Louis suburban area, the Kansas City suburban area, or here in Springfield. We have some really strong candidates. Our fundraising has been stronger than it's been for a very long time. So without question, there are going to be things that happen at the national level that we can't control and that will absolutely have an impact on elections here in Missouri. But as far as the things that we can control with our candidate recruitment, with our fundraising, we are far and above where we have been in the past at this point in an election cycle. So I think going in, we are well positioned.
I want to ask about Springfield because I've been covering Missouri politics for about 20 years. And Springfield, well, I will not say it has been like uniformly Republican. It has often been seen as a big GOP stronghold. And we now see a situation where there are 3 Democratic lawmakers instead of just 1. You're going to have a Senate race, which I think for all intents and purposes is going to be a toss-up when in years past it was pretty safe for Republicans. Why has Springfield become so competitive over, especially when other parts of the state, like Jefferson County or Buchanan County or even St. Charles County, they've gotten more Republican, especially in the decade of Donald Trump?
So a couple things there. I would say if you actually look at how Springfield has voted over the past 20 years, the city limits itself, it hasn't shifted all that much. There have been a number of times over the past couple of decades where we have had multiple Democrat state reps from the city of Springfield. So that's not particularly unusual. So I would push back a little bit on this notion that like Springfield has been just this solid red bastion forever. Greene County as a whole is certainly very conservative, and certainly all the rest of Southwest Missouri is. But the city limits of Springfield have always been tighter. In the past, the districts have been drawn a little bit differently, where they incorporate more of both the city and the county. Right now, the district lines more follow city lines. It's not exact, but it's a little closer to following the city lines. So I think that has an impact on the makeup of the delegation from Greene County a little bit. But I will say, I do agree with you. There have been some slight shifts. And I think a lot of that is because of the growth in the universities here in Springfield. Missouri State, which I'm excited about this, has seen rapid growth over the past 15 years. Some of the other universities here, Drury University, we have a really strong tech school here. Like, they've all seen strong growth. And as we know, students tend to vote more Democrat than Republican. So I do think, to the extent there have been some slight shifts here, it's in large part because of the tremendous growth of our universities here, which overall has been a very strong positive for the city, for our economy. It's been helpful.
One of the quirks of this election year is there's no U.S. Senate race and there's no gubernatorial race. The only statewide contest is auditor. And not to disparage the Democrats who are going to run against Scott Fitzpatrick, but they're going to be the underdogs. Until they are able to piece together a rural, urban, suburban coalition like they did, say, during the Jay Nixon era, the Republicans are going to be favored in statewide races for the time being. But the big things on the ballot are going to be these ballot initiatives that Republicans have put forward. You have this proposal that would repeal much of an abortion rights initiative that voters approved in 2024. You have another measure that would restrict constitutional amendments that are put forward to the voters through the initiative petition process. You may have this income tax plan that's put up for a vote. You may have the congressional map that you all passed in the special session go up for a referendum. I got to go back to the national environment again, though, because you may run the best campaigns for all those things I just mentioned, but they could all be brought down if Democratic turnout is high because it's a midterm election under a Republican president. Is that a fair thing to assume, that it's not going to be easy to pass any of these things if it is not a great year overall for Republicans nationally?
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that assessment at all. I think that right now, and understandably so, you do see a high level of Democrat enthusiasm for showing up at the polls and voting. And so, yes, I think that's true. Without some really compelling thing at the top of the ballot that will drive out Republican turnout, that is going to be a tricky dynamic for us that we're going to have to navigate. And we've done that before. We've had plenty of other tricky election cycles, and like we've talked about, how we've overperformed in those. But yes, you are correct. That is a tricky dynamic for us.
Going back to the new Amendment 3 on abortion. So I have followed abortion rights politics, again, for 20 years. I am well aware there is a large segment of Missouri voters and Missouri people who feel that abortion is morally wrong, and they were probably really upset when it was enshrined in the Missouri Constitution that there would be pretty strong protections for the procedure. So I am not saying that I expect a blowout defeat for the new Amendment 3 just because of that reality. But I think the challenge that abortion rights opponents have is the reason Amendment 3 in 2024 passed was not because of Democrats. It was because of several 100,000 Donald Trump voters who voted for Donald Trump and Republicans and who voted for Amendment 3. How are you going to convince those voters that they were wrong 2 years ago and they should repeal almost all of what they thought was a good thing to put in the Missouri Constitution?
I don't think it's so much about saying that they were wrong. Last year in 2024, voters had really just one of two choices. Is they could have the status quo in place, which at that point was essentially the most pro-life laws in the United States, or what was placed on the ballot, which was the most pro-abortion laws in the United States. And what I think we saw is the voters said, we think our laws in Missouri are more pro-life than we're comfortable with. So they voted in favor of Amendment 3, which I understand. So what we tried to do with the legislation that was crafted last year and is now going to be a question on the ballot for the voters to consider is to essentially give them a third option where we say, okay, we understand that the public wants a lot of exceptions in place or certain exceptions in place. We understand that and acknowledge that that's where the public is. And what we tried to do is put something that was more pro-life than what the prior Amendment 3 allowed, while also putting in place those exceptions that the proponents of last Amendment 3 really ran on, and ensure that those protections are in place, but also ensure that there are pro-life laws that are still in place. So it creates kind of a third option for voters to consider going into this year's election cycle.
Is the campaign, though, going to focus on the fact that it also would ban gender affirming care for minors? Because I look, there have been Democratic ballot initiatives that have focused on things that are tertiary to what really the amendment is about. Clean Missouri in 2018 is a good example of that. But I'm going to be very candid with you, Representative. If the entire campaign is we need to pass this in order to, stop kids from doing gender affirmation surgery, it's going to look really cynical, and it's going to be looking like you're not actually running on what the new Amendment 3 is, which is to restrict abortion. So, what would you be comfortable with in terms of how that's presented to voters?
Well, I think it's about both of those things. As we know, the sunset that is on our current laws that I would articulate are there to protect kids are set to expire here in a year or two. And while it's a priority for the House to get these bills done and that sunset eliminated so that the laws are permanently on the books, there's no guarantee that's going to happen this year. Because to your point, we have a major filibuster that we're going to have to deal with all session long. It's going to be a hard session to pass a lot of those types of big controversial things. So I think for us on this side of the issue, we're wanting to make sure that we have, I kind of consider it belts and suspenders. You have protections in place in the Constitution and hopefully in the statute books as well. So I think it is important for this new Amendment 3 to pass for both of those reasons, to have our laws go in a more pro-life direction, but to also protect kids.
My last question for you, I would be remiss if I didn't ask a redistricting question, because most people who follow me know that I was obsessed with the topic, but after going through the special session and being so tired at the end that I went to Columbia on the Thursday before it ended and forgot that school was in session because I was just so tired. I don't know if I really like the topic as much as I used to, but here's the thing about the new congressional map. The most important court case right now, in my opinion, for the 2026 election cycle is whether the map was frozen when the referendum proponents turned in the signatures. I've looked at prior precedent, and prior laws were frozen. Like, right to work didn't go into effect in 2017 when the opponents of right to work turned it in. I know it's a little difficult to predict what courts are going to do, but is that are you also bracing for the reality that the map you passed last year will not be in effect this cycle, and it's going to be up to the voters to put it into effect in November to determine whether it goes into effect in 28 and 30?
I do think that's certainly a possibility. For me, as both a legislator and an attorney, it's hard to predict with any certainty what any individual court will do, and then ultimately what an appeals court will do and the Supreme Court will do. But that's certainly a possibility. I'm not going to say it's not.
Do you think that voters will approve the map? I actually think there's a 50-50 shot if it's put on in November that the voters approve it, just because if it's presented as let's have a more Republican congressional map and there's more Republicans voting, it wins. But I could also see if there's more Democrats energized, it loses. What's kind of your feel for how it would fare in a referendum?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think 50-50 is a reasonable assessment. I would agree with that for the exact same reasons that you articulated.
That was House Majority Leader Alex Riley, a Republican from Springfield who will likely become the next Speaker of the Missouri House in 2027. You can read and listen to all of our coverage of Missouri state politics by going to stlpr.org. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Thank you so much for listening. Politically Speaking is produced by Sarah Kellogg, Rachel Lippman, and me, Jason Rosenbaum. The show is edited by Fred Ehrlich. Read all of our coverage at stlpr.org. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Politically Speaking by searching the term Politically Speaking on Apple Podcasts. From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.